Nucla, Colorado, November 2015. Life insurance sales dictate that all sales must be done in person with signatures on the dotted line to seal the deal. As such, you are not employed until your legs are underneath a table. Sales in Denver, for this particular multi-level marketing, were reaching a point of direness. While Colorado has been a gold mine in terms of growth, thanks to the transplant liberal infestation that has found its way here, the devastation financially it has left on the general populace would make you think outside of, say, Colorado Springs, or the suburbs, that you are in the deep trenches of Alabama's level of poverty. Sales, therefore, are consistent, as we prey on anyone we can, but for the everyday salesman, it is feast or famine. It was therefore not uncommon for us who had risen through the ranks of greed to be sent out anywhere and everywhere to secure sales. I myself took I-70 out as far as Kansas, to secure weekend sales, to keep our general numbers up, and myself employed. On one such return trip, my lead packet contained a place which no one had used or exploited in years. It included places I, a Colorado native, had never heard of: Natarita, Redvale, Norwood, and of course, Nucla. These places struck me as inherently disturbing. Their populations were minuscule, even for hollowed-out remnants of mining infrastructure. Many who remained were teetering on leaving themselves. When I entered to these towns, entire swaths of them were utterly empty. Brick and mortar after brick and mortar, nothing but hollowed-out shells. I began to fear I wouldn't be able to get gas or even a place to stay, which would put me behind, which is bad when you work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. It is no exaggeration in these fog-ridden towns that I could have walked buck naked down the road for perhaps an hour, and have been the only living soul. The few people who remained in the towns were so scarce that I was quickly the talk of all areas. Everyone, of course, knows the few men or women who keep him sane in such a place, serving as a connection to society, I suppose. So a new face, interviewing you in a black suit and tie, laptop and case by his side, perhaps seemed momentous enough that one should call thy neighbor. Things went as they normally do, more no's required towards every yes. A down close here, a do I need, can I afford it? There. The homes to me were quite jarringly different. Where the first I met, I believe in Redvale, had a home of such fine furnishing that I had never seen an almost aristocratic take on the heritage of coal mining, complete with all amenities of the upper class and higher. By nightfall, I had trudged through mobile homes all the way out to my final destination. A remote home, on the hill, to which every appointment prior smiled that I should have such an appointment on my list. I thought not much of it, until I saw the place. By far the strangest construction of a home I had ever seen. To say it was hideous would be a lie. Perhaps in the early 70s such a place might have been charming. But it was as though every section of this massive thing had been built onward, once every few decades, as absolutely nothing of either era of style flowed or remained consistent. One could very easily walk from vinyl floors to hardwood to shagged carpeting in this bizarre place just by crossing a threshold. It also seemed to lean on that hill, as part of it was elevated into the side of the plateau, and so everything seemed doubly askew. I had dealt with many a client, whose home inspired pity in my soul: cat piss, poor accommodations, poor living space, child destruction, pet destruction, even apparent self-destruction. But this one was a first in my book. For all the incredible space within this bizarre place, every inch seemed to be occupied to the absolute brim with hoarder treasure, not the least of which was boxes, and boxes and boxes of newspapers tall as a man. Swaths were dedicated also to taxidermy. A noble elk might make its appearance to a less than noble squirrel. Even for my tastes as a hunter, these things were of poor quality, and should impress no one. They were fit only for destruction. The lighting also seemed to suffer here. I cannot tell if that was because they were so far removed from what little civilization existed in these hollowed-out towns that they needed their own generator, or if it was simply the standard quality of the home's own age showing as light would brighten and dim in warm oranges past mountain-high piles of book and newspaper. Some areas had no lighting at all, and were instead lit with oil lamps. Years later, upon my transference to home insurance sales, I can look back on that alone and say I perhaps never should have sat down there amongst a potential inferno. I don't pretend to remember this man's name or his wife. They were, with no disrespect, country, and more of the high hills type, than the wheat and field type. They were incredibly hospitable and even treated me to food, some very good sausage, complete with home-brewed tea and crackers. I've always had a soft spot for cheese and crackers. Wallace and Gromit gave me that, so I was feeling uncharacteristically charming and dropped my robotic salesman of death act. After all, I knew no sales would be possible here, and I had already secured 4,000 ALP on this trip anyhow. We chatted about the state of affairs of politics, a death sentence to any sale if you are wrong in your assumptions, and spoke of the impact of their implications upon the town's increasing direness of the mines. Trump was mentioned a few times, in the hope that he should stop what he would soon address as the American carnage. Things, I felt, were going quite well, and this was a strange end to such an exhausting trip but a welcomed one. Eventually, the man of the house requested that his wife should leave us to discuss business. In life insurance, this is always a red flag. They were referred to as one-legs. You cannot have anything signed without the other half there to confirm. Even if they do, you are looking at fall-off. But he assured me it was quite all right, and so did she, so I simply presumed that this was the extremely unique situation, of the man asserting himself as financial overseer and split duties of managing one's marital affairs. The business, as it ran its course and my 3 down closes seemed to fall of playful deaf ears, shifted tone at the moment where I thought it was my time leave. I had noticed he had said some odd phrases and seemingly, when I had responded later with seemingly innocuous rebuttable, his eyes perked up and he smiled as if hanging on an earlier chapter of our conversation entirely.
You're younger than the ones they normally send. You even look younger than you are. I thought they preferred the old salts to the young.
I figured at this point, he was referring to prior run-ins with my MLM. It wasn't entirely uncommon, they, and I myself were guilty, of double-tapping phones annually till my packet was beaten raw to set the appointments. Hunger is the underbelly of greed.
I've always been old, no matter when or what time I find myself in. I understand what you mean, you are not the first to tell me that, but I've never aged since 17. Rest assured, I have and always will be, an old soul.
He clapped his hands suddenly in excitement and remarked he thought we, Royal, had stopped coming altogether with the way things were looking, but assured me great progress was being made in the mines, and that they were on the cusp of getting the wheel out soon. Before I knew it he was on his feet and beckoning me to follow him to show me what he meant. I must have looked somewhat annoyed. I don't know anything about coal mining terminology, let alone what boasts well for a town of this size financially, but you have to reciprocally amenable. He showed me outside the foyer, though in this place, everywhere I suspect was where a fire could be kept, to the upstairs. His wife also seemed bizarrely excited and rushed past us to fetch something in the attic. The second story of this place factored no lighting at all, save his oil lamps. The halls were claustrophobic, already of poor construction making them wide enough for passage, were subject to maze-like barriers of course, newspaper boxes, damp and bound with twine. I was shown to a small room, which he welcomed me into, which contained a much different catalogue of trinkets, tall walls of shelving, glass vials, all labeled with varying minerals sealed and labeled, photographs lay strewn about of desks and other strange assortment of mining paraphernalia. Much of it looked exceptionally old. The room also contained a window which overlooked the separate works outside of the house. My smile must have betrayed me, for my great-grandfather also had a similar hobby of collecting rocks and minerals in a similar fashion in Texas, and there's always something wonderful to a boy in minerals. He seemed to take that as a sign and began to show me specific samples, explaining in no short detail, that in due time, they'd have the rest of the wheel, and handed me a large corked bottle. Inside it is hard to describe, but I will do my best as I remember it. It had the look of wearied copper, the way it exfoliates that sweet caustic blue/green. I reasoned that it was not in fact stone or rock, but some type of metal. It seemed to be fractured, with a small quarter of it rattling with specks of either rock or itself at the bottom. Its construction was like a smooth bend of flat road, but only enough that by holding it away from you could you perceive that. The metal's underside was ridged in overlapping waves, like Faraday ripples carved in its innards. The outside seemed to have oval section after oval section, with a thin line dissecting them down center. He told me then as I examined, confused.
No, I understand it's not as much as you lot were expectin', but we got even more of them out there, but you know how they are. Here, watch this.
He pointed to the window, past the shed, and fumbled his hands on the cluttered desk for some tinted hooked glasses, with leather sides. It was dark as dark gets in November, but I put them on anyway. I had no idea what I was in for. Perhaps this guy was going to blow phosphorus up, but at this point one thing had become clear to me, even if my inner monologue could not entirely verbalize it. This man thinks I'm someone that I am not. Before I can react he is gone, and soon enough his pounding footsteps trace my eyes from his location to entering that shed. There I stood for a few seconds, feeling uncharacteristically ashamed, but assured myself the mistake, for whatever this is, was his. I had explained perfectly over the phone via transcript, to the letter, like the robot that I am, who I am, and what I was doing here, and anything extrapolated from that, was his fault. Assuring yourself that you are never wrong is Sales 101. I didn't have much time to process the thought, however, as light, as bright as fucking dawn, erupted out of that shed. The glasses were not enough, and it was accompanied by a colossal surge in sound. I jumped out of my skin and dropped that bottle, but I couldn't even hear the glass break over the thundering cacophony that now consumed the house. Institutionally, I leapt back and just kinda stood there like a rabbit might process a storm for a predator, paralyzed. Immediately, I thought, I have somehow stumbled into some type of drug trade affair. Meth is not an uncommon in Colorado, and this man had just blown his lab before my eyes to smithereens. But as I crept back towards the window, it wasn't that at all, and the light was just as great as it was at its dawn. The noise was also not that of an explosion. It was a droning thing, of incredible magnitude, like a lighthouse foghorn. Loud enough to shake the boards of this rickety reconstructed place, and to make you cover your ears on instinct. The light had died, but my eyes, already burned by the contrast of dim oil to that of the sun even through the glasses, unfortunately made it impossible to tell what was exactly happening between my newfound adrenaline and the green/white spot of afterimage. As the sound would pick up too, like a horn, lowering and then towering back to full mast. But soon I became aware that something was violently moving beside me, enough to draw my newfound wallpaper of the floorboards and draw my attention to my feet. There amongst the fractured glass twisted and bounced like dust on a speaker the metal pieces. It moved in manners that, even accounting for fluctuations of say cheap magic like the rubber pencil trick, were impossible, and I should say what I saw in those metallic ovals staring back up at me triggered immediate, mortal, response. I turned, resolved to escape this hillbilly Lovecraft knockoff that time forgot, and pushed through the shaking structure. In the hall, towards the attic, the lady of the house stood, staring back at me, with a smile which I believe contained even now, no malice, lit only by the shaking of her oil lamp. Whatever she said, I know it was a question. Lip reading is not my forte, but probably something inquisitive. I felt sick, and as the walls seemed to bellow with the still roaring highs of that horn, like a great wind shaking a rickety bridge, I swear that I saw in her clothes the scattering of something just beneath the cloth. Like a mass of rats, were trying to claw their way out. Flight or fight is something we never understand until we are there. I've run from men and I've fought others, depending on circumstance. This, however, had run its course to the veins of my core. I resolved to flee at any cost. Be it either the high of adrenaline, the movement of this house I had become convinced was no alive and would be no more soon enough. I stumbled and ran like a moth, burnt by the hubris of veering too close to the flame. I tore through that house possessed and wordless, tipping and crashing through with my lanky limbs as if she were right on my heels. The downstairs was a minor beauty to me, for the halls that entrapped me now vanished in semi-familiar mountains and less flexible structures to the horrible noise. I hit the door screen to the porch with such force that I tore it clean from its hinges and took part of it with me a few paces into the gravel. I took to my car and fled. A trail I blazed could have stoked fire, and I should say even after 16 hours of work and consciousness that I had entered into a state of pure functionality. Non-mortal shock is a strange serenity. You just keep going and time really doesn't mean anything. I found myself a day later, hundreds of miles away, and had apparently ran the car right down to the gallon, where I can only presume I slept then after. It had cost me one laptop, and a briefcase full of folders of prepped materials, and a good chewing out by the higher-ups who expected me back and working over a day ago. I wasn't far from a Waffle House, so I went, sat and ate my eggs just the way I like 'em. Poached. I just ate, and waited. It wasn't really till after I was convinced I should be waking up back in that place, that I tried to begin to piece together what exactly happened there. I kept turning it over and over in my head, like licking a morsel stuck between the teeth until the tongue goes raw. But it just didn't make any sense beyond the facts of what had actually occurred. In the end, I never went back to Nucla, and my time at the MLM would soon run its course, as I could no longer bear the life of a corporate life drainer, who sustained himself on the suffering of both consumer and underling alike. I moved on to other things, and enjoyed newfound success elsewhere in more reputable insurance companies. But to this day I still look back, wondering if it actually really happened that way. Perhaps I was right, and they were some type of drug producers. Perhaps I had been drugged in the meal, and everything I gazed out and saw was the terrible hallucinations of a young, stressed mind. It wouldn't explain my left ear, which I do recall, as I ate that poached egg, continued to bleed, and which I have lost some decent amount of hearing. Should anyone know anything about wheels, mining, or horns, or even if they should know anything about nuclear, I'm always willing to listen. A Polak though I may once have been, I've grown tired of the political gambit, and I'm seeking a more introspective point in my life. I figure if anyone could contextualize what rabbit hole I found myself staring down with great bright lights, I should be very grateful.